And welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba. I'm going to pick up where we left off last time. Next chapter is called The Man of Many Names. Without a doubt, the first blatantly antichrist-like figure that we read about in Scripture is someone the Bible refers to as Nimrod. This individual is very significant for a lot of reasons, which will become apparent by the end of this blog. I believe Nimrod was a giant like so many of his cousins. Let's look at the Hebrew. And I've got the Hebrew depicted there on the website, and both the New American Standard Bible and the King James Bible rendering of it underneath the Hebrew. The name Nimrod, Strong's number 5248, is a word that both Strong's and the NAS exhaustive concordances say is, quote, from foreign origin. In Genesis 1:15, the word biblical commentary notes that the name means, quote, we shall rebel, though he admits that the etymology is by no means certain. But most scholars seem to agree that the name essentially means, quote, the rebellious one, end quote. Therefore, it was probably more of a title than a proper name. That being said, I believe he has gone by many other names, many other proper names, described by many cultures of antiquity. Before I get into that, I want to address the phrase, quote, began to be a mighty one, end quote. I'm going to address that one first. The word began used here is the word hehel, or chalel in Hebrew. Strong's number 2490 defines it as men began, defile, break, defile, eat as common things. A primitive root, compare chala, proper to bore, i.e. by implication to wound, to dissolve, figuratively to profane a person, place, or thing, to break one's word, to begin as if by an opening wedge, to play the flute, begin, men began, defile, break, defile, eat as common things, first, gather the grape thereof, take it, inheritance, pipe, player on instruments, pollute, cast as profane, self, prostitute, slay, slain, sorrow, stain, wound. So there's a lot of ways that we can look at that word. This is extremely interesting, but now let's look at the word translated as mighty one to see just how interesting it really is. The word translated as mighty one is Gabor in Hebrew. That's Strong's number 1368. There has been some debate regarding this word as it can be used in a variety of ways also. Here are a few mentioned in Strong's. Champion, chief, excel, giant, man, mighty man, one, strong man. Notice one of the ways that it can be used includes the word giant, though this word is not as popular in that regard as other Hebrew words such as Nephilim or Raphaim. The word Gabor seems to be more of a description of a man who is indeed mighty in the sense of a warrior. But when you look at Genesis 6:4, there appears to be an interesting connection. Genesis 6:4 says there were giants, that's the word Nephilim, in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, which is the word Gabor, which were of old men of renown. This seems to be saying that the Gabor can be considered the offspring of the Nephilim, which we know were giants. This is not always the case, though. Take David's mighty men, Gabor, of valor in 2 Chronicles 25:6, for instance. I don't believe these were Nephilim offspring, especially since one of the things these guys did was hunt down giants. So we can't be overly dogmatic about the word itself. I believe its meaning must be taken into context with its in the sentence. So what are we to think concerning Nimrod? I believe, given what we know concerning the other sons of Ham and their offspring, it is reasonable to assume that through profaning or defiling himself, Nimrod became a mighty one in the sense of being an offspring of the Nephilim. Put another link. There's another guy who's got some interesting observations in that regard, so you can click on that and see what somebody else has to say about it. What we don't see in Scripture, I believe, can certainly be derived from the writings of cultures concerning this man. In his book, The Giza Discovery, author Peter Goodgame has done a masterful job of laying the foundation of who this guy was to the ancient world and who he will be in the days ahead. The Bible calls him Nimrod, but to the ancients he was known as Gilgamesh, Baal, Melkart, Adonis, Eshmun, Dumuzi, Dionysus, Bacchus, Orion, Mithra, Apollo, Ra, Tammuz, and Osiris. There are others. Actually, there are quite a lot of other names that he has gone by. The more you research this, the deeper it goes. But I primarily want to focus on the first and the last in the list above, which was Gilgamesh and Osiris. Before I do that, I'd like to explain why he is known by so many names. The Bible tells us about one of the things Nimrod did that made him famous. He was the one who orchestrated the building of the Tower of Babel. According to the book of Jasher, Nimrod led a team of 3 camps, each with a specific mission to accomplish with the completion of the tower. One camp intended to kill God. Another intended to strike him with bows and spears. The third planned to set up their false gods and worship them in heaven. So what we see here are the attributes of the first Antichrist. He wants to kill God and set up a one-world system with himself as God. But when God saw all that they intended to do, he decided to do something about it. The first thing we must realize is that the Tower of Babel was not just a tall building. God didn't freak out when we built the World Trade Centers. No. Nimrod was building what we might call a Stargate today. The Tower of Babel was literally a portal through which Nimrod intended to reach into heaven. And apparently this was possible. Genesis 11:4-7 in the King James Version says, "And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." From that text, it would seem that Nimrod's plan was possible, at least in the sense of reaching into heaven. We know that we can't build a building that is high enough to literally enter into the third heaven where God dwells. Therefore, something else must be meant by this. Somehow, Nimrod and his people created something that could bridge our world and that of the heavenly realm. God put a stop to it. He confounded their language and separated the people of the earth. In the New Living Translation, Deuteronomy 32:8 says, "When the Most High assigned lands to the nations, when he divided up the human race, he established the boundaries of the peoples according to the number in his heavenly court." I chose that translation because it seems to be more accurate than most other translations that render the last part as, quote, "according to the children of Israel," end quote. The New Living Translation seems to draw its translation of this verse from the Septuagint, which says, "according to the angels of God." In Barnes' Notes on the Bible, the author writes, "Some texts in the Greek version have 'according to the number of the angels of God,' following apparently not a different reading, but the Jewish notion that the nations of the earth are 70 in number." Compare this author's note on Genesis 10:1, which you could click on there and see what he has to say about that verse. And that each has its own guardian angel. Compare Ecclesiastes 17:17. This was possibly suggested by an apprehension that the literal rendering might prove invidious to the many Gentiles who would read the Greek version. King Wells, the author of Ancient Myths and the Bible, reinforces this belief on pages 12 and 13 of his book. He says, remember, we must prove a thesis from more than one source. So let's look at Deuteronomy 4:19, which says, unless thou lift up thine eyes unto heaven, and when thou seest the sun and the moon and the stars, even all the hosts of heaven, shouldest be driven to worship them and serve them, which the Lord thy God hath divided unto all the nations under the whole heaven. King Wells notes, once again we see that God divided the nations according to the hosts of heaven. And throughout the scriptures, the hosts of heaven has referred to angels. The book of Joshua confirms this idea as well. In chapter 48-43, it describes the throne of Pharaoh as follows. And the throne on which the king sat was covered with gold and silver and onyx stones, and it had 70 steps. The narrative goes on to describe the reasons for the 70 steps, stating that they represent the 70 languages of man. Note verses 45b through 47 of chapter 48, which says, also, any man who understood to speak in all the 70 languages, he ascended the 70 steps and went up and spoke till he reached the king. And any man who could not complete the 70, he ascended as many steps as the languages which he knew to speak in. It was customary in those days in Egypt that no one should reign over them but one who understood to speak in the 70 languages. In the next chapter of Joshua, we see in the account of Joseph being made second in charge of Egypt that Pharaoh's officers protested the idea of someone ruling over them who did not know all 70 languages. This would have presented a problem for Joseph if it were not for an angel of the Lord coming to him that night and teaching him all 70 languages. That's actually a pretty cool account if you want to read it for yourself in Joshua chapter 49, 9 through 18. What's the point? The point is simply this. After the confusion of the tongues at the Tower of Babel, men went away talking about the same guy, Nimrod, only now in their new language. Thus, Nimrod, the great, mighty warrior hunter god king, became known by many different names throughout the world. With 70 different nations and languages coming out of that one event, it is now easy to understand how Nimrod could be known by at least 70 different names. Earlier, I said I wanted to focus on two names in particular, Gilgamesh and Osiris. Let's start with Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest stories ever written. Many people have made the connection that Gilgamesh is just one of the many names for Nimrod. I've got a link here to, it says David Livingston does a good job of making the Nimrod-Gilgamesh connection, so you can read what he has to say about that. And the internet is literally loaded with information and resources that testify to the two names representing the same individual, those two names being Gilgamesh and Nimrod. He's often depicted as a giant. We can see in the picture to the left that he's holding a lion under his arm. The ancient text also makes the statement that he was, quote, 2/3 God and 1/3 man. This would certainly seem to support the Nephilim genetics case I'm making regarding the children of Ham. There is much I could write about concerning Gilgamesh, but that's all I will focus on for now. I will return to this character again shortly. Now let's turn our attention to Osiris. Osiris is a very well-known character in both history and mythology. He plays a prominent role in secret societies and even in our own government. But more than that, I believe he is the central character we need to look at when it comes to understanding the times we live in and what is to come in the near future. For instance, did you know that Osiris is the only other god of antiquity, apart from Yeshua, that was known as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Quote, he is exceedingly mighty and most terrible in his name, Osiris. He endureth forever and forever in his name, Un-Nefer. Homage be to thee, O King of Kings, Lord of Lords, ruler of princes, who from the womb of Nut hast ruled the world and the underworld. That's an excerpt from a hymn to Osiris in the Book of the Dead. I've got a link there if you wanted to check it out for yourself. As stated above, Peter Goodgame has done an amazing job of connecting the dots and explaining the Osiris myth, so I won't go over it all here. Please take the time to read part 2 of the Giza discovery to learn more, and I've got a link there for you to do so. There are, however, a few things I would like to point out here in order to set the stage for some of the conclusions I will draw later. Osiris' symbol is the Ankh, which looks remarkably like a cross. One dominant theory is that the loop at the top of the Ankh represents resurrection, as in the rebirth of the sun, and I've got a link there for you to check that source. This would seem to go along with the numerous dying and resurrecting sun gods born on December 25th that are found in the ancient world. And suffice it to say, it is not by chance, coincidence, or accident that the Son of God was crucified on the symbol of the sun god. With that in mind, I feel it is important to note that in Nimrod's incarnation as Osiris, you can truly see a mirror or a reversed image of Jesus. Where Jesus is the Son of God, the Christ, the Messiah, Osiris is the exact antithesis. He is the sun god, the false Messiah, the Antichrist. This is one of the primary reasons why I believe Christians should have absolutely nothing to do with associating Jesus Christ and the date December 25th. It is not Jesus' birthday. It was the birthday of Nimrod, Osiris, Baal, Mithra. As an aside there, go on BibleGateway.com and in the search box punch in Baal. And then read everything that the Old Testament has to say concerning Baal. And you'll have a pretty good idea about how God feels about that individual. Who Baal is just more or less a generic term for Lord, but Lord in the sense of God as in little g God, false gods. And I've got a video here, actually, a YouTube video with Michael Rood. He's got a show called The Rood Awakening, and he does a really great piece discussing Christmas and its pagan origins and why we as believers really shouldn't have anything to do with it. So you can watch that video if you'd like. As I write here, it is not my intention to build a comprehensive case against Christmas in this blog. I've got a link here. Click here if you'd like to view more videos on the subject. The bottom line is, in Deuteronomy 18:9, God told the Israelites not to have anything to do with the traditions of other false gods. He considers that an abomination. And if our God is, quote, the same yesterday, today, and forever as the Bible claims he is, then I suspect that the Word that became flesh on our behalf would give us the same warning. It has been my experience that few, if any, Christians want to hear this message and will fight you tooth and nail over it. And that was certainly true. If you go on my Facebook page, just look at all of the bashing that went on around Christmas and some of the posts that my wife and I put up there just trying to say, hey, guys, we shouldn't have anything to do with this. People don't want you to mess with their traditions, that's for sure. But because I believe I have been shown this truth, I have a responsibility to herald it. This is Ezekiel 33, 1 through 6 in the New Living Translation. It says, once again a message came to me from the Lord. Son of man, give your people this message. When I bring an army against a country, the people of that land choose one of their own to be a watchman. When the watchman sees the enemy coming, he sounds the alarm to warn the people. Then if those who hear the alarm refuse to take action, it is their own fault if they die. They heard the alarm but ignored it, so the responsibility is theirs. If they had listened to the warning, they could have saved their lives. But if the watchman sees the enemy coming and doesn't sound the alarm to warn the people, he is responsible for their captivity. They will die in their sins, but I will hold the watchman responsible for their deaths. All I can say is I've sounded the alarm. It's up to you to heed it or ignore it. Needless to say, Christmas Day, as defined by December 25th, is not Jesus Christ's birthday, but rather the birthday of the Antichrist, the dying and resurrecting sun god of antiquity, who hasn't resurrected yet. Hasn't resurrected yet? What's that about? In the book of Revelation, Jesus is repeatedly referred to as the one who was and is to come. That theme carries through the early part of the book of Revelation. But once you get to chapter 13, you start to read about a beast who is later described in chapter 17, 8 through 11, as the one who, quote, was and is not, and yet shall be. More on that later. The other thing I want to point out regarding the Osiris-Nimrod connection is their association with one of the most prominent and easily identifiable constellations in the sky. That, of course, is the constellation Orion. Like Gilgamesh and Nimrod, Orion is also known as the Mighty Hunter. In The Two Babylons by Alexander Hislop, the author writes the following in chapter 2, called Death of the Child. He says, though we do not find any account of mysteries observed in Greece in memory of Orion, the giant and mighty hunter celebrated by Homer under that name, yet he was represented symbolically as having died in a similar way to that in which Osiris died, and as having been translated to heaven. And he's got a footnote there. It says, see Ovid's Fasti. Ovid represents Orion as so puffed up with pride on account of his great strength, as vain gloriously to boast that no creature on earth could cope with him, whereupon a scorpion appeared and, says the poet, he was added to the stars. The name of the scorpion in Chaldee is Akrab, but Akrab, thus divided as AK-RAB, signifies the great oppressor. And this is the hidden meaning of the scorpion as represented in the zodiac. The sign typifies him who cut off the Babylonian god and suppressed the system he set up. It was while the sun was in Scorpio that Osiris in Egypt, quote, disappeared, according to Wilkinson. And great lamentations were made for his disappearance. Another subject was mixed up with the death of the Egyptian god, but it is specifically to be noticed that as it was in consequence of a conflict with a scorpion that Orion was, quote, added to the stars. So it was when the scorpion was in the ascendant that Osiris disappeared. From Persian records, we are expressly assured that it was Nimrod who was deified after his death by the name Orion and placed among the stars. So now that we have connected Nimrod with Gilgamesh, Osiris, and Orion, I will begin to pull it all together and paint a picture that I believe perfectly illustrates what is to come. Everyone knows the Giza Plateau is aligned with the belt of the Orion constellation. The Giza Plateau has received a lot of attention throughout history, but never as much as I believe it is now and will in the very near future. In 1999, Zahi Hawass, the current Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, claimed to have found the burial tomb of Osiris below the Giza Plateau. This is a quote from Zahi Hawass. He says, I have found a shaft going 29 meters vertically down into the ground, exactly halfway between the Chephren pyramid and the Sphinx. At the bottom, which was filled with water, we have found a burial chamber with 4 pillars. In the middle is a large granite sarcophagus, which I expect to be the grave of Osiris, the god. I have been digging in Egypt's sand for more than 30 years, and up to date, this is the most exciting discovery I have made. We found the shaft in November and began pumping up the water recently. So several years will pass before we have finished investigating the find.
What is this?
Susie, this is the tomb of Osiris,
The god of the underworld. This once extravagant mausoleum, a moat with 4 pillars engraved with hieroglyphics constructed thousands of years ago, was intended to be a shrine for the keeper of the afterlife.
That was more than 10 years ago. I've got another link here. It says, just imagine what they found under the Giza Plateau since then. And you can click that and go to a website that's got a lot of pretty wild stuff. A few years later, another astonishing and related discovery was made, but this time in the desert of Iraq. On Tuesday, the 29th of April, 2003, a BBC news report came out announcing that archaeologists had discovered the tomb of Gilgamesh. I have copied the entire article below because it would not surprise me if it disappears from the original BBC website soon. And I've got the article here, as well as a link to the original BBC article. But the article says, Gilgamesh tomb believed found. Archaeologists in Iraq believe they may have found the lost tomb of King Gilgamesh, the subject of the oldest book in history. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written by a Middle Eastern scholar 2,500 years before the birth of Christ, commemorated the life of the ruler of the city of Uruk. from which Iraq gets its name. Now a German-led expedition has discovered what is thought to be the entire city of Uruk, including where the Euphrates once flowed, the last resting place of its famous king. I don't want to say definitely it was the grave of King Gilgamesh, but it looks very similar to that described in the epic Georg Fassbinder of the Bavarian Department of Historical Monuments in Munich told the BBC World Service Science in Action program. Magnetic. In the book, actually, a set of inscribed clay tablets, Gilgamesh was described as having been buried under the Euphrates in a tomb apparently constructed when the waters of the ancient river parted following his death. We found just outside the city an area in the middle of the former Euphrates River, the remains of such a building, which could be interpreted as a burial, Mr. Fassbinder said. He said the amazing discovery of the ancient city under the Iraqi desert had been made possible by modern technology. By differences in magnetization in the soil, you can look into the ground, Mr. Fassbinder added. The difference between mud bricks and sediments in the Euphrates River gives a very detailed structure. This creates a magnetogram, which is then digitally mapped, effectively giving a town plan of Uruk. Venice in the desert. The most surprising thing was that we found structures already described by Gilgamesh, Mr. Fassbinder stated. We covered more than 100 hectares. We have found garden structures and field structures as described in the epic, and we found Babylonian houses. But he said the most astonishing find was an incredibly sophisticated system of canals. Very clearly, we can see in the canals some structures showing that flooding destroyed some houses, which means it was a highly developed system. It was like Venice in the desert.
Imagine the startling proposition that the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty men of old, the gods and children of the Watchers, could somehow rise up, could somehow be reconstituted inside of a body. And, of course, I've discussed with you before my theory that one of the greatest legends in history could be a record of that having actually happened. And I'm referring to Nimrod, who some scholars also identify as Gilgamesh of Sumerian fame, Apollo of Greek fame, Osiris of Egyptian fame. And this Gilgamesh was a giant who a lot of people didn't even believe was anything more than myth until his grave marker was found a few years back. And then, according to some people, the military swooped in and took possession and control of that dig.
Hey, Tom, I want to interject something. I talked to a special operations general who was there when Gilgamesh's remains, and his words were he was in a state of remarkable preservation, okay? He said they have Gilgamesh's remains. So if they have Gilgamesh and he is Nimrod, they got it. And the whole point was to extract the DNA.
When the Iraqi regime fell in April 2003, the Iraqi Museum in Baghdad and museums in other provinces such as Mosul, Basra, and Babel were exposed to theft for 2 consecutive days. The theft was carried out by local and international networks as well as Iraqi and Arab agents. It is estimated that 170,000 artifacts were stolen, 15,000 of which have no registration records. The most important of these artifacts are the Sumerian cuneiforms, which represents the philosophy of life and death.
Many date back to Mesopotamian times, more than 4,000 years ago.
Artifacts pertaining to the civilizations of the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Chaldeans, and others that go back thousands of years in history, were taken away from the land of the 2 rivers.
In addition, entire book collections from certain historic eras disappeared from the National Library, thus negatively affecting Iraq's wealth of civilization and culture.
One must also mention that some artifacts were stolen and sent to Israel via the American forces.
American troops stood by as Iraq's heritage was plundered. One memorable moment that week was when Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld dismissed the looting in Baghdad as unimportant.
Freedom's untidy, and free people are free to make mistakes and commit crimes and do bad things.
Many of the looters knew which objects they were looking for and where to find them. In other words, they were insiders.
Investigations revealed that the main metal gate of the storage rooms was opened. It was not opened by force, which means a person who knew where the key was participated in the theft.
I believe these 2 incredible discoveries the tombs of Osiris and Gilgamesh telegraph the beginning of the end.